What's up, everybody? John TheMorgile here, back for another Static Plain Truth video. Before we get started, I want to thank all my patrons on Patreon. You can go there, www.patreon.com/TheMorgile, or support this channel directly at www.paypal.me/TheMorgile1. At any rate, I want to thank everybody, through Patreon, all my supporters, everyone that supports through PayPal. You guys are the best. Love you guys. So anyway, getting right to it, this video is intended to answer a few questions. How does the eclipse work on the flat Earth model? Why does the shadow of the moon travel west to east when the moon apparently rises in the east and sets in the west? Does this prove flat Earth? Does this prove the heliocentric theory model or falsify it? We will address all of these questions, but the first thing to keep in mind is the behavior of the celestial lights or celestial bodies are quite irrelevant to the shape and nature of the Earth. We can measure the Earth for motion and curvature using basic physics and geometry, respectively, and neither of these things exist in the slightest sense. Looking to the heavens to prove or disprove curvature of the Earth, or prove or disprove what's going on down here on the stationary physical plane, is an interesting endeavor, but we can't really take the magnificent heavenly light show and apply it to the physical Earth, as there are too many variables between our eye and the source of the celestial lights, quite frankly. And this applies to either model. So, not in the heliocentric model, because the Earth categorically isn't a spinning sphere in space, and we can't apply, this sort of tattooing celestial lights to flesh out the shape and nature of the Earth in the flat Earth reality scenario, because we really don't know how far the sun and moon are, or even what the sun and moon are. So we can't really say with 100% certainty what's going on in terms of eclipses. And frankly, neither can theoretical physics and their standard model, for several reasons which we'll go over. Now, there have been many historical attempts to triangulate on the sun and moon, and we all know that science has arrived at various conclusions depending on the underlying assumption of a hypothetically spherical Earth or an obviously flat and motionless Earth. The biggest factor, which has never been accounted for, starting with Eratosthenes and his famous high-tech experiment to prove the size of the spherical Earth by assuming the Earth is a sphere and measuring the angles of the sun shadows using the very high technology of the ancient Greeks, being a hole in the ground and a stick in the ground, separated by a few hundred miles upon approximately the same meridian line at the same time. Of course, the same sorts of experiments applied to the sun and other factors have caused theoretical alliance to arrive at a conclusion where the sun is allegedly 93 million miles away and essentially concurs. So modern science essentially concurs with Eratosthenes. Now, the problem is, Eratosthenes was not aware of, or if he was aware of it, he certainly did not apply the extreme effect which is caused by the plane or atmosphere itself, which behaves as a subjective convex lens surrounding all observers to varying degrees, really depending on the weather. So, how can modern science concur with Eratosthenes' triangulation method when he wouldn't have been aware of, or at least he wouldn't have applied, the major cause of sunrise and sunset, which is indeed atmospheric lensing and refraction, with a little bit of perspective in there as well. But it has nothing whatsoever to do with geological axial rotation, which doesn't exist. We can measure for that. The Earth isn't spinning on an axis, certainly not, faster than the speed of sound in the United States, and certainly not over 1,000 miles an hour relative to the axis at the equator. So there are, also other factors which historically and currently cannot be accounted for in terms of what is going on with the source of the celestial lights, and what's going on in between that source and when the celestial light hits our eyes. So there are factors that historically and currently have not been accounted for, which are essentially unknown, or at least theorized yet unaccounted for factors of the effect which the magnetic field of the Earth has on inbound celestial light waves. Now, it's hard to believe, but light waves will actually adhere to or bend with or propagate more readily through magnetic lines of force, which can be visualized lots of different ways. One way is to take some metal shavings and sprinkle them over a sheet of paper that is above a magnet, and the shavings will sort of adhere to the magnetic field lines. Light will actually do a similar thing. It will adhere to strong magnetic flux lines, which are generated by the Earth itself. There's also evidence for plasma tubes in the lower magnetosphere or magnetoplane, whichever vernacular you wish to use. The magnetosphere is allegedly about 600 kilometers up, at least that's the starting point, so the lower magnetosphere. And in the flat Earth reality, it could be lower. We simply don't have the ability to reach such altitudes as 600 kilometers or even 100 kilometers, which is why all rocket launches to space are obviously faked missions which jettison rockets off into the sea, and a multi-billion-dollar production begins to fool everyone by NASA and Roscosmos and all the other agencies. So, while we do have physical evidence for these ionized plasma tubes in the lower magnetosphere, imaged by the Murchison Radio Telescope Array by Cleo Loy out of the University of Sydney, Australia, in conjunction with Castro Scientific Institute, whatever. Now, ionized gases are essentially what occurs inside of a light bulb or like a neon light, while plasma is more akin to what is occurring in a plasma ball. Electrically charged gases are adhering to the Earth's magnetic field lines, creating tubes of plasma which run meridionally or from north to south. While the magnetic field lines indeed penetrate the Earth right down at the ground level, the conditions necessary for these ionized plasma tubes to form or to occur appears to be exclusive to the very high altitudes, which are ascribed to the lower magnetoplane or lower magnetosphere, which is very high up. Regular modern science claims it begins at about 600 kilometers. We really just don't know. We can't trust NASA and all the other space agencies because they've lied about everything else. So, while the magnetic field lines indeed penetrate the Earth at the ground level, the ionized plasma tubes are pretty high up. And this is not theoretical stuff that is claimed by flat earthers. This is stuff that was imaged by, globe Earth theoretical physicists using the Murchison Radio Telescope Array in a binocular fashion to literally image these long theorized tubes of ionized gases which run meridionally. Now, these natural ionized plasma tubes could certainly perturb light waves, so inbound light from the celestial objects, hypothetically, it could perturb those light waves or electromagnetic spectrum waves in all sorts of ways. However, these north to south flowing plasma tubes way up in the sky could potentially be what actually caused the phenomenon of the sun itself. This may sound crazy at first, but it actually makes tons of sense when you consider spectroscopy alleges that the sun is made up of hydrogen and helium, although, of course, modern science claims that the sun and other stars are performing this whimsical, theoretical, non demonstrable, non falsifiable, hypothetical, pseudoscientifical act of hot atomic fusion. It seems to me, in my own personal opinion, that the sun is not a physical, spherical object making circuits over the flat Earth, but instead the sun is some type of energetic reaction or sonoluminescence, possibly, which is physically enabled or supported by the very ionized gases that adhere to said meridional lines of magnetic force. These tubes of gases, ionized plasma tubes, could very well be comprised of hydrogen and helium, as well as other low density gases, which show up in spectrographic readings, hence the theoretical assumption that the sun is powered by these gases, performing the theoretical and preposterous theory of atomic fusion. Now, it seems that since oxygen is mainly found in the lower areas of the troposphere or troposphere at levels of about 21% oxygen near sea level, about 10% oxygen at 20,000 feet, and the atmosphere continues to get less and less oxygenated proportionally with distance up. So it's logical to assume that oxygen is basically more or less absent at the altitudes where these ionized hydrogen and helium gases can be found. Thus, the highly flammable or normally highly flammable hydrogen would not have the oxygen needed to react or explode, but could certainly luminesce due to a variety of possible factors, including but not limited to the simple ionization of the gases, plus sonoluminescence, for example, or something completely different that we haven't thought of or we're unaware of. Um, the main point I want to highlight here is that we have no idea what the sun is or how high the source light of the sun is. Even Dr. Robotham, who wrote the groundbreaking book Zetetic Astronomy back in 1865, go ahead and place a card for that entire audiobook playlist right here. Dr. Robotham also failed to account for atmospheric lensing, refraction, and other unknown factors, as mentioned a minute ago, in terms of how light can be affected by magnetic fields or ionized gases, as well as the atmosphere or atmosphere itself. So, while Rowbotham's efforts to triangulate on the sun using a flat Earth matrix as opposed to Eratosthenes' sphere were noble efforts indeed, although it's obvious that the resulting figures extracted using plane trigonometry as opposed to spherical trigonometry cannot possibly be correct, as the angular size of these celestial lights are both magnified and bent or warped or refracted, reflected, diffuse, scattered, and all sorts of other Waffle House shorthand by the natural media which light waves travel through to eventually meet our eyes, which also happen to be convex lenses. Our eyes happen to be convex lenses, just like the atmosphere which subjectively surrounds us all happens to be a giant convex lens. So it really is no surprise that objects or lights way up in the sky are greatly magnified in terms of their angular size. And obviously, the light is refracted, which causes sunrise and sunset, moonrise and moonset, star rise and star set, as well as the counter rotation of the stars in the south, is all due to atmospheric refraction and or the magnetic field of the Earth. So, with all that being said, Rowbotham's estimation of the solar distance and size just couldn't not possibly be correct. In other words, the nearly 4,000 mile distance to the sun works very nicely in terms of triangulating on the sun and estimating its size to be around, 35 miles in diameter using Eratosthenes' very method, but assuming a flat Earth, of course. But because he failed to factor in, this is Rowbotham and Eratosthenes, both of them failed to factor in atmospheric or atmosplanic refraction, magnification, and all these other unknown factors that are naturally occurring from the Earth, which can cause immense perturbations to electromagnetic waves. And of course, light waves are just a sliver of the overall electromagnetic spectrum, meaning light waves will necessarily be affected by magnetic fields, such as the one generated by Mother Earth herself. So at this point, we know that the Earth is a stationary plane. We know this because of simple, demonstrable, repeatable physics and geometry. Very simple stuff. Knowing this fact, we know that the Sun cannot possibly be 93 million miles away. We know that it cannot possibly be, a million miles in diameter or whatever, and we know that it cannot possibly be theoretical, hypothetical, hot atomic fusion. 93 million miles away. And we also know, because knowing the Earth is a stationary plane, that the moon is not some 238,000 miles away. Also, the apparent angular size of these objects being approximately identical under most normal circumstances, that is, the sun and the moon. This is a huge coincidence in the heliocentric theory model, the odds that a planet would have a moon that is apparently the same angular size as the theoretical host star are 1 in many, many millions. Now, the odds that a so called planet in the heliocentric theory model would host life are also 1 in many millions, according to estimations like the Drake equation theory. Now, the odds that a single planet would both have intelligent life and have an apparently equally angular sized sun and moon, the odds to that are beyond plausible in any stretch of the imagination. But this is just one example of major coincidences that we must accept in order to believe in the heliocentric theory. Another coincidence would be the fact that we always see one face of the moon at all times forever. And of course, Liontism claims that this is because while the moon takes a month to orbit the Earth, it also just so happens to take exactly a month to do one axial rotation. So isn't that convenient and a huge coincidence? But of course, they make up this whole big theory of tidal locking, which has to do with the theory of gravity, which is a whole nother topic altogether.
What is gravity?
I have no idea. Okay, next question.
This is called gravity.
What is gravity?
I have no idea. Okay, next question.
Neil, I gotta say, you're totally blowing my mind right now.
That's what I do. I'm Neil deGrasse Tyson, bitch.
There are a lot of coincidences and assumptions that one must swallow hook, line, and sinker, and the fisherman and his boots in order to believe in the heliocentric theory. So there are a lot of claims going around the flat Earth community that the upcoming eclipse on August 21st, on the 21st of this month indeed, somehow proves a flat Earth. Now, the main argument appears to be the fact that while the moon allegedly orbits the Earth, this is all according to the heliocentric model, the moon allegedly orbits the Earth counterclockwise if you're looking down upon the Earth system from the north. And this counterclockwise motion of the moon is alleged to be at around 2,288 miles per hour relative to the Earth at a distance of about 238,000 miles, while the Earth allegedly also rotates counterclockwise as well at around 1,000 miles an hour near the equator, covering 180 degrees of rotation over 12 hours, or 15 degrees of rotation per hour. The alleged rotation of the Earth is why we see the sun and moon rise in the east and set in the west, and the moon's alleged orbital velocity in accordance with the Earth's alleged axial rotation. Just to give you a little bit of a description of this animation, it is not to scale. It's not intended to be to scale. It's very difficult to draw the solar system to scale because, of course, the moon would have to be about 30 Earth diameter distances away, and that's just not practical for animation. So this is not intended to do anything except to show a point that it is possible for the peculiar, indeed, inverted conical shaped shadow of the moon to apparently travel from west to east, where the moon apparently rises in the east and sets in the west. So to this observer here, indicated by the little red dot on the equatorial area of the globe that's spinning around, obviously the person on the globe is spinning at a slower speed than the moon is spinning. However, they're spinning at a faster angular speed. So again, the person on the edge of the globe would be spinning about 15 degrees per hour, while the moon would only be going through a fraction of its orbital cycle in that same time period. Hypothetically, according to the logically repulsive heliocentric hypothesis, say there's 28 days in a month, divided by 360 degrees is about 7.8% of its orbit in a day. And of course, we'll divide that by 24 hours in a day, and you get a whopping 0.032% of the moon's total monthly orbit per hour. So 0.03% of a 360-degree alleged orbit is not that much of an angular change. Now, I'm not saying that this means the Earth is a spinning sphere or any of that. I'm just saying that it's hypothetically possible to have the heliocentric layout where the moon's shadow, or the totality of an eclipse, travels from west to east. As counterintuitive as it may seem, just as much of the other stuff in the heliocentric hypothesis theory seem counterintuitive, they have had 500 years to perfect all of the hypothetical mathematics. And so this animation is, again, it's not to scale. The moon should probably move less than an inch in this scenario. Um, However, it's just to show you for animation purposes that it is possible to have the Earth rotating counterclockwise, orbiting the Sun counterclockwise, while the Moon hypothetically orbits the Earth counterclockwise. It is possible, as you can see in this rather juvenile animation, but the red dot, again, indicating the observer would actually see the moon rise in the east and set in the west, and that shadow would apparently travel from west to east. So it's counterintuitive, yes, but I've got bigger fish to fry with eclipses than this west to east motion of the eclipse signature. Not least of which is, of course, orbital mechanics in general being a physical impossibility according to the gravitic heliocentric theory verse. But we'll get into that a little bit later. So I want to go on the record and state that the west to east shadow of the moon doesn't prove or disprove flat Earth or globe Earth. It doesn't look good for the globe for lots of other reasons, but this west to east shadow thing is really not that big of a deal. These guys have had 500 years to crunch the numbers and make everything work out theoretically. That's where they've arrived at all the conclusions they've arrived at, but that's why we also see so many contradictions, because a false premise cannot actually be true, and therefore when you start to fact check the premise, of course this premise being a spherical spinning orbiting Earth, it falls apart under logical scrutiny. You can't have contradictions in something that is the truth. So, according to the logically repulsive, ridiculous, absurd heliocentric hypothesis, the alleged rotation of the Earth is why we see the sun and moon rise in the east and set in the west, and the moon's alleged orbital velocity in accordance with the Earth's alleged axial rotation, as well as the Earth's alleged orbit around the sun. Yet the alleged distance to the moon causes the moon to apparently travel across the sky at a faster rate than the sun, even though technically you would sort of think that the moon would travel across the sky more slowly than the sun, since the moon is, allegedly orbiting the Earth in accordance with the spin of the Earth. But of course, this has to do with something like parallax, I guess is the best way to describe it. So, like if you're driving down the highway, the fence posts near the road will appear to pass by the window of the car very quickly. However, a very distant building or mountain will appear to be more or less stationary, or apparently will move much slower than any of the nearby fence posts and such nearby things. So, during the upcoming eclipse, which will pass right over the United States this month, again, August 21st, 2017, we will see the shadow of the totality or the signature of the eclipse crossing the entire U.S. from west to east. Now, it's been claimed a lot that by flat earthers that this proves flat Earth or disproves the heliocentric theory model. However, I can't get on board with this claim. While the west to east shadow doesn't appear to make sense or favor the heliocentric model, indeed, over the hundreds of years that they've been fine tuning their deception or their theory, they've made it so that that actually does work in theory. So, in other words, the west to east shadow of the moon does not debunk the heliocentric theory in any way. The reason I think this is such a point of contention right now is because it is difficult to think in 3 dimensions using the scales involved with the heliocentric model. I did make a couple of animations to show how the shadow of the moon can appear to travel west to east when the moon appears to rise east to west. This is technically, hypothetically possible in the heliocentric model theory or in the hypothesis centric universe theory, but that doesn't mean that it's truly what's going on. I'm just stating that they've made it work mathematically, and it can be animated as such. Even though, yes, my animation is juvenile and not to scale, it shows the premise of essentially what's going on. Hypothetically, in the heliocentric theory, and why the moon appears to rise in the east and set in the west, yet the shadow of the totality of the eclipse appears to travel west to east. Although that sounds counterintuitive in the heliocentric hypothesis theory model, it is mathematically possible and geometrically possible. So I don't think we should make such a big deal about something that is not a big, huge problem with eclipses. So let's go over some of the big, huge problems with eclipses, the actual big, huge problems with eclipses, indeed. Now, of course, there are plenty of problems, however, with the phenomenon of eclipses, both solar and lunar, in terms of the heliocentric theory model. For example, the shadow of the moon on this upcoming eclipse will be about 75 miles in diameter during this particular total eclipse. However, there have been a few annular eclipses, which annular eclipses are sort of like a total eclipse, although the moon is apparently a little bit smaller than the sun, so you get a ring around the obstruction, assuming the obstruction is the moon. So, at any rate, during a few in the last 100 years, there have been a few annular eclipses which cast a shadow of totality, which is about 2 miles in diameter. And the dates of those eclipses were January 3rd, 1927, May 20th, 1966, and May 9th of 1948. Now, one of the biggest problems with the heliocentric theory and eclipses, in my opinion, is the wildly varying size of the shadow cast by the eclipse. Also, the heliocentric theory relies upon the shadows of spherical bodies to cast a convergent conical shapes which taper away from the object obstructing the source light, as opposed to divergent conical shapes expanding away from the obstruction, as we see with light and shadow in reality. In reality, the shadow of a certain cross section of an object will either be as large as or larger than said cross section of the object. Um, if the object is hypothetically a sphere, then anytime that object obstructs a light source, it will always represent a consistent cross section, as opposed to, say, a rectangular object, which would cast a varied shape of shadows depending on the cross section of it, which is obstructing the source light. So, in other words, a sphere will always cast a perfectly circular shaped shadow, regardless of the angle of light which the object is transiting. Now, I'm not saying that a sphere is the only thing which will always cast a circular shadow, as we can see on these water bugs, where they rest their tiny little legs on the surface of the water, and that surface tension causes perfectly circular indentations or dips in the water, and those dips in water often cast very dark, very well defined, and persistent shadows. So, again, spheres will always cast circular shadows, but that is not exclusive to spheres. There are other things that will cast circular shadows. So, while a sphere will always cast a perfectly circular shaped shadow, regardless of the angle of the light which the spherical object is transiting or obscuring. So, spherical objects will always cast spherical shadows. However, never can anyone demonstrate in reality the shadow coming from a sphere to diminish in size with distance from the object. The only time this sort of thing occurs is hypothetically in the heliocentric theory, because such converging conical shadows are necessary in order for the heliocentric model to work. So, with that being said, it is thus assumed by liance or theoretical astrophysics that such conical shaped shadows must be occurring because they adhere to the asinine hypothetical theory verse regardless of the evidence presented to them. Now, while the moon appears to be rather large in the sky, representing about a half a degree of the apparent celestial sphere, this is obviously caused by severe atmospheric lensing or magnification of the light of the moon coming through the atmosphere and being magnified. I know this sounds pretty far out at first, but when you actually study how the light source of distant celestial objects behave, it becomes very obvious that the atmosphere acts exactly like a giant subjective convex lens surrounding every observer. So, while the moon appears to be rather large in the sky, this could all very well be caused by just very strong, severe atmospheric lensing or magnification of the moon. And sticking with the law of demonstrable physics related to light and shadows, if the moon is indeed transiting the sun to cause solar eclipses, then the moon cannot possibly be larger than 2 miles in diameter. Now, I'm not necessarily making this claim, but again, strictly adhering to demonstrable attributes of light and shadow, it's possible for an object to cast a shadow far larger than its actual angular size, and can only produce a shadow as small as its actual angular size. So, with that law of light and shadows in mind, unless there are some unknown variables involved, which we'll get into in the heliocentric theory model, the moon couldn't possibly be larger than about 2 miles in diameter, according to the shadow cast by those three eclipses, at least historically documented eclipses, where the shadow of the moon was about 2 miles in diameter or less. Well, the fact that three annular eclipses mentioned earlier cast a 2 mile diameter shadow shows that at least one time, and actually three times, this gives us some very interesting data about the moon and its possible actual size. Now, if we know the moon's actual size, then that can actually help us triangulate on it while ignoring the magnification of it through the lens of the atmosphere. So, if the moon is hypothetically only 2 miles in diameter, and I know this sounds pretty far out, and is quite distant, as we presume that the moon is quite distant, then the apparent angular size of the moon, according to an observer on Earth, must necessarily be dramatically increased by way of atmospheric lensing or magnification, which makes total sense since we know the Earth is flat and stationary, and simple perspective, doesn't really solve this rising and setting of the celestial objects. However, when you add atmospheric lensing and refraction into the mix of perspective of these allegedly high up sources of light, then it actually makes perfect sense. 100%. And that is the rising and the setting of the sun, stars, and moon, due, of course, to refraction. Now, this also means that this data, these instances of eclipses where the path of totality was only 2 miles wide, again, assuming what causes solar eclipses is the moon transiting the sun, then even the flat Earth values that are usually used in terms of the size and distance of the moon and sun, that data doesn't really agree with it. And again, that would be roughly, say 3 to 4,000 miles distance to the sun in the flat Earth sort of triangulation method, as well as approximately similar size and distance to the moon in the sort of old school Robotham Zetetic estimates of these objects. However, we still have this pesky problem of the shadow of the moon being so very small as 75 miles, as in the case of the upcoming eclipse, and several times as small as 2 miles, because since we know the Earth is flat and we know that the moon appears to be much larger than it actually is due to atmospheric lensing, then I think that we really need to take into account the smallest shadows that the moon casts during eclipses, because that very well may give us some excellent data about the actual size of the moon, which would actually help us to define its distance up. That is, of course, if the moon is a physical object at all. Or if it's a reflection of a physical object or something totally different. We really don't know. The moon may be a spherical object up in the sky, or it may not be a spherical object up in the sky. But NASA's certainly never been there. They've lied about all that crap. So we're sort of stuck at square one in terms of what's going on in the heavens. We can certainly theorize about that. But it's best to measure the Earth, realize that it's flat and stationary first, then go about figuring up what the heavens may be. Again, I'm not making this claim, but if the moon is actually only 2 miles in diameter and it's quite distant, as we presume, then the apparent angular size of the moon, according to an observer on Earth, is dramatically increased by way of atmospheric lensing or magnification, which absolutely occurs as light passes through the gradient layers of atmos plane overhead. And light will always bend or refract in terms of atmospheric refraction towards the higher density gradient. So it's going to bend towards the ground, typical in most typical senses. Now, if you've got warm air and cool air that light is traveling through, then that will have, that can have inverting effects to the light. But under normal circumstances, um, light will refract and tend to bend down towards the ground. Now, in terms of lunar eclipses, changing gears just a little, the heliocentric model claims that the Earth is transiting the Sun, according to an observer on the Moon. However, this claim is debunked by the rare selenelion events, where the Sun and Moon are visible at the same time in the same sky by the same observers during the totality of a total lunar eclipse. Now, this is categorically impossible in the heliocentric theory model. However, Theoretical Alliance has, of course, come up with complex apologetic excuses for these observations. And by the way, these lame brain, half baked apologetic excuses for the selenelion events in the heliocentric hypothesis theory do not explain the observation. Like you'll see diagrams where they have the observer represented as like being, I don't know, 4,000 miles tall so that they can see over the curve of the Earth. Maybe I'll find a slide or two. But yeah, when you see scientists trying to explain away the selenelion events, which is, again, pretty rare, but it happens pretty commonly, where the sun and moon are both visible in the same sky during a total lunar eclipse for the, during the totality of the event. Which means, of course, it cannot be the Earth that is allegedly obscuring the sunlight from reaching the moon. Alliance also tries to throw refraction and, of course, the bizarre umbra, penumbra, converging and diverging sun rays, which we've already discussed and we'll discuss further. But anyway, it's just preposterous the lengths to which people have gone historically to support the belief system, the religious belief system, that they live stuck to the side of a rapidly spinning sphere in outer space around the sun at 66,600 miles per hour as the sun races around the galaxy at some 500,000 miles an hour, and the galaxy races through space in some other divergent direction at some millions of miles per hour. And so the Earth itself is allegedly moving in many different, diverging directions at once around often conflicting curvilinear paths, hypothetically, although in reality the Earth has never moved a single yard, and the idea of infinite space only exists in cartoons and movies like Star Wars, and propaganda like Star Trek and Lost in Space, which were propaganda to prep society or prep culture for the eventual space programs, which were, I believe, set out with the best intentions, but ended up being essentially infiltrated by literally Nazis after World War II, and became more a propaganda agency than it was a space exploration agency. And no, that is not hate speech against Germans, because I myself happen to be an eighth German. And no, this isn't me hiling to Hitler, because my wife's half Jewish on her mother's side. So, because you know how that topic always gets brought up in scientific conversations, right? Jeez. So anyway, NASA became more a propaganda agency than it was a space exploration agency. And in fact, we need to be exploring parallel to the ground. There may be much, much more land out there other than just what's known in the Earth realm of the physical plane. Furthermore, the frequency of total solar and total lunar eclipses over the course of 100 years is approximately the same. It's about the same number of times over 100 years you get lunar and solar eclipses total, that is. Now, in other words, this means that during the period of 1901 to 2000, there were 228 solar eclipses, and that includes all types. And during the period, the same 100-year period, there were 230 lunar eclipses. So only two more lunar eclipses of all types during that same period. And so this is really quite counterintuitive with the heliocentric theory in mind, and we'll get into that. Now, one would logically expect lunar eclipses to be extremely common, as the full moon should pass within the Earth's shadow very frequently. However, such events are just as rare as solar eclipses in reality, which should be far less common. Solar eclipses, that is, should be far less common than lunar eclipses, simply according to the heliocentric layout. Because, of course, the Earth's shadow is supposedly not forming a divergent, expanding shadow, as we always see in reality, but is instead allegedly casting a convergent, conical shadow, which only exists in imagination verse theory. So it's claimed that the Earth's shadow is a relatively small area in space, which the moon must perfectly pass through, just as the sun is a relatively small area in space for the moon to pass in front of. Now, this is absolutely ridiculous if you just think about it for 10 seconds and apply how light and shadow actually work. As the Earth's shadow should behave as shadows do and spread out from the Earth obstructing the sunlight, forming a much larger area than the Earth, or an area at least 8,000 miles in diameter, a circle 8,000 miles in diameter at least. That's what we should see. And possibly an expanding amount of shadow. But of course, the heliocentric theoretical alliance, what do they do to cope with this major dilemma in terms of light and shadow in their model? Right? So, like, how can the moon, if it's 2,000 miles in diameter, cast a shadow that's 2 miles in diameter, or even 75 miles in diameter? Shadows don't behave like that, period. So, what do they do to sort of keep their scientific model going? Well, they simply purport that the light from the sun is essentially intersecting with itself at some point between the Earth and the sun, and diverging from that point to cause a source of light which magically creates inverted shadows as a rule. And that would be inverted shadows that cannot be demonstrated in reality anywhere as a rule. So this is, of course, a major contradiction in their own theory, or the staples and pillars of the very heliocentric theory, as the sunlight must be approaching the Earth at nearly perfect parallel lines across the entire face of the Earth in order for the Eratosthenes experiment to work. And by the way, again, theoretical alliance concurs more or less with Eratosthenes' values. So, which is it, Lions? Is the sunlight attacking the entire face of the Earth at parallel lines? Or is the sunlight converging and diverging to create a light source specifically conducive to creating inverted conical shadows as a rule? And again, that is inverted conical shadows, which cannot be demonstrated in reality as a rule. But you simply can't have both. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have the sunlight coming in all at 90 degrees or parallel to one another, and the sunlight being intersecting to cause conical shadows at the same time. Do you understand? It's a contradiction in their own theory. And this is just one of many, but this is why the heliocentric model theory is rubbish. It just doesn't work. Now, let's just say hypothetically we'll go with both in theory. So we'll stick with the original with Eratosthenes' rule of parallel sunlight hitting the face of the hypothetically spherical Earth, and then the shadow of the Earth would remain 8,000 miles in diameter through space for quite a distance. All the way to the moon, because we do see lunar eclipses that are allegedly caused by the transit of the Earth between the sun and the moon. Of course, we know that's rubbish. There's no way that the flat stationary plane of existence, the physical plane, can obstruct the moon, the sunlight. But at any rate, we'll stick with Eratosthenes' rule of parallel sunlight hitting the face of the 8,000 mile diameter Earth. Then the shadow of the Earth would necessarily remain 8,000 miles in diameter through space, all the way to the moon, possibly even expand. One could argue that the shadow of the Earth would become less and less potent, or attenuate or fizzle out with distance, which it may. However, you certainly can't argue that it becomes so impotent that it cannot cast a shadow upon the moon, as we do indeed see lunar eclipses in reality. And again, we're just humoring the heliocentric theory model to see how preposterous it is. Now, this indeed poses a logical problem or fallacy. For if the Earth's shadow is at least 8,000 miles in diameter, or logically should be according to Eratosthenes, then we should see total lunar eclipses regularly and partial lunar eclipses most of the time. Indeed, the full moon would be a rare sight, given it's supposedly on an orbital path 5 degrees divergent from the ecliptic plane, or the alleged orbital path of the Earth. Furthermore, if the sunlight was all coming in at parallel lines as necessary for Eratosthenes' value to work, then the shadow of the moon should be at least about 2,000 miles in diameter. Yet we see it as little as 75, 50, and even 2 miles in diameter. Now, if we go ahead and ignore Eratosthenes' necessary assumption for the globe Earth theory model to work, so we'll just ignore one of the staples of their theory, and we'll go with the modern explanation of the peculiar shadows cast by the Earth and Moon only in the heliocentric theory, but not in reality, which diminish in size due to this peculiar behavior of the source light of the sun. Where the moon will cast a pinpoint shadow upon the Earth, and you can hypothetically claim that is how the 2 mile diameter or even 75-mile diameter shadow of an object, which is supposedly about 2,000 miles in diameter, can work. It can only work hypothetically if you claim this bizarre, peculiar behavior of light and shadow that you can't replicate in reality. Now, this perfect alignment between the Earth, Moon, and Sun during solar eclipses must be so precise, we should only expect to see the phenomenon of solar eclipses when the Moon passes in front of the small angular size area of the Sun, which happens to be almost exactly the same angular size area of the Moon. The sun is a bit larger during annular eclipses, but this means that the lunar orbital plane must be aligned with the ecliptic plane during solar eclipses, and a very precise, pinpoint accurate beam of shadow is magically formed. The problem here lies with specific eclipses, which have actually crossed over both the north and south polar areas. This is physically impossible in the heliocentric theory model, as the Earth is only tilted at 23.4 degrees, allegedly, from the ecliptic plane, and the furthest northing or southing we should possibly see of this pinpoint of theoretical shadow necessarily coming from the moon, which is perfectly aligned to the sun and ecliptic plane during an eclipse, according to an observer on Earth. Now, the big problem is here there are these few pesky examples where the totality of total solar eclipses have traversed both polar regions in separate examples. Again, this is categorically impossible according to the heliocentric theory model, as we are currently humoring the contradicting portion of the story where the sunlight is coming in at a divergent angle to cause said peculiar inverted shadows that cannot be demonstrated as a rule. This means that the pinpoint shadow cast by the moon during a solar eclipse would typically be found, as a rule, within tropical areas more or less, or perhaps slightly outside of the tropical areas, due to this pinpoint alignment on the ecliptic and the Earth's alleged tilt only being at 23.4 degrees. There is absolutely no explanation in the heliocentric theory for a solar eclipse signature to traverse either polar region. However, this has indeed occurred on multiple occasions, including total solar eclipses. So, the argument regarding the west to east shadow of the moon technically can work theoretically and mathematically, but only if you assume the Earth to be a spinning sphere, for which there is no evidence, and indeed a world full of evidence contrary to this theory. So the west to east path of the shadow of the moon is not really relevant to the conversation, as it can be shown to hypothetically work in the heliocentric theory model. However, we must swallow a ton of contradictions and coincidences to accept the heliocentric theory in the first place. So, how does the eclipse work on the flat Earth model? Quite frankly, the answer to that question is it is irrelevant, as the Earth is demonstrably not a spinning sphere, which wins this debate every time over hypothetical sizes and distances for the celestial lights or objects. So, why does the shadow of the moon travel west to east when the moon rises in the east and sets in the west? It's because we're allegedly spinning on the polar axis at a much faster rate than the moon is hypothetically orbiting the Earth in terms of the radius of each hypothetical circuit. So at the equator, we're allegedly traveling at 1,000 miles an hour around the central axis, which is about 4,000 miles in radius. This causes a stationary observer to make allegedly one complete circuit around the Earth every 24 hours. In terms of the moon, while it allegedly travels around the Earth at about 2288 miles per hour relative to the Earth, along a radius of about 242,000 miles, taking a full month to make one orbit, or about 28 days to complete one circuit, allegedly in the heliocentric theory. Now, the cause of a solar eclipse, according to the heliocentric model, is a brief alignment which is only realized to observers on the Earth at specific places, as the Earth allegedly spins to place the observer beneath the shadow of the obstruction of the sun, which we'll just assume is the moon, for multiple practical reasons, although it could be something else entirely that causes solar or lunar eclipses. But while the moon is allegedly orbiting west to east around the Earth, we hypothetically are moving faster at an angular rate than the moon, even standing at the equator, as our radius of movement upon a spherical Earth is a mere 3.2% of the radius distance to the moon, assuming the heliocentric distance of 238,000 miles from the face of the Earth to the moon on average, plus an additional 4,000 miles to the center of the Earth, where the Earth's alleged center of gravity resides, for a total orbital radius of about 243,000 miles orbital radius on average. So while the moon is allegedly traveling faster than the spin of the Earth in terms of miles per hour, going from west to east, the moon would apparently be moving through space for an observer on Earth, mostly due to our alleged axial rotation, and has far less to do with the alleged orbital motion of the moon. Because again, it takes the moon a full month to do one circuit around the Earth, while it takes an observer on the Earth only 24 hours to do one full circuit. So, hypothetically, humoring the heliocentric theory, we see the moon rise in the east and set in the west due to our alleged spin. However, the moon is also allegedly traveling in the same direction as we're spinning along a much longer radius. So, if the moon were to hypothetically transit the sun in this system, assuming the heliocentric model, the shadow of the moon could actually travel from west to east due to the alleged distance between the moon and the sun. Essentially, it's a change in parallax from our observational perspective on the allegedly spinning Earth. And of course, they assume the sun is much more distant than the moon, so you have it's a parallax deal more than it is a motion of the moon deal. It's us spinning into the alignment of that shadow more than it is the moon traveling to that point in space in the heliocentric theory. So, wow, I don't know if I just confused everybody more or less. I don't know, but um, we do see the moon rise in the east and set in the west due to our spin, but the moon is also allegedly traveling, orbiting in that same direction along a much longer radius. So, that's where we get this parallax change. The moon's shadow can indeed travel west to east, hypothetically, on the heliocentric globe Earth theory. So, one big point I would like to make is I think it's a mistake for flat earthers to claim that certain phenomenon are proof or disproof of one thing or another, um, especially because science or theoretical astrophysics has had hundreds and hundreds of years to put their hypothetical model together, and they've got mathematical fixes for all these things. Most of them. I mean, it's all hypothetical, but you have to swallow all these hypothetical, non demonstrable things in order to adhere to the heliocentric theory. While there's a world full of evidence that the Earth is actually indeed 100% stationary without any geological inverse square curvature. It's not a sphere. It's not spinning around. And so to say that, eclipses prove or disprove things to me, I think it is actually quite irrelevant. Eclipses work very nicely on the flat Earth. There are many problems with eclipses that I've already mentioned in this video in the heliocentric theory, but the west to east shadow transit is not really an issue. I'm sorry to say, I don't mean to attack anybody, but I don't think that flat earthers should hang their hat on something that is just going to be knocked down by theoretical lions. Because, I mean, if I can animate it out and show it, then they can animate it out and show it much better. So, there's that. Anyway, while the moon is allegedly orbiting from west to east around the Earth, we would hypothetically be moving at a faster angular rate than the moon, as our radius of movement upon the spherical spinning Earth is a mere 3.2% of that of the orbital radius of the moon, assuming the heliocentric distance of 238,000 miles from the face of the Earth to the moon, plus an additional 4,000 miles to the center of the Earth, the Earth's alleged center of gravity, plus another 1,000 miles to the center of the moon, for a total orbital radius of, on average, about 243,000 miles on average. So again, while the moon is allegedly traveling faster than the spin of the Earth in terms of miles per hour, the moon would apparently be moving through space, again, mostly due to our alleged axial rotation in the heliocentric theory. And it would have much less to do with the actual motion of the moon, because the moon takes a full month to do one circuit in their model, while the Earth observer only takes 24 hours to do one circuit. So again, we see the moon rise in the east and set in the west due to our alleged spin. However, the moon is also allegedly traveling in that same direction along a much longer radius. So if the moon were to hypothetically transit the sun, assuming the heliocentric theory model, the shadow of the moon could actually travel from west to east due to the alleged distance between the moon and the sun, essentially the change in the parallax due to the distances involved in the heliocentric theory, as well as the same sort of parallax change in terms of the alleged rotation of the Earth and hypothetical orbit of the moon. So, does any of this prove flat Earth? Does it prove the heliocentric model or falsify it? I would say no, no, and yes. So, no, it doesn't prove a flat Earth. No, it doesn't prove the heliocentric model at all. But I would say yes, eclipses do falsify the heliocentric model. And again, the reason I'm saying that is because until someone can demonstrate convergent conical shadows, inverted shadows, then it's theoretical. So it's non-demonstrable. It's pseudoscience for people to claim that the only way for their model to work is that shadows are inverted in the way that they normally behave in reality. So the elements which actually prove a flat Earth is geological measurement. Every test ever performed, every experiment ever conducted, shows the Earth to be a plane without any curvature and certainly no inverse square curvature falling away from an observer at sea at an exponential rate in all directions. Similarly, simple physical tests prove that the Earth isn't in motion. Furthermore, orbital mechanics, as described by the heliocentric theory, using intricate, complex mathematics governed by the theory of gravity, proximity, and velocity, simply does not account for the behavior of bodies in hypothetical free space, such as the moon, orbiting other bodies in motion in hypothetical free space, such as the Earth, orbiting other hypothetical bodies in free space, such as the Sun, which are orbiting a hypothetical center of the hypothetical galaxy, which is also traveling at some millions of miles per hour. The behavior of the moon itself, just the moon alone, completely contradicts the heliocentric theory in terms of orbital mechanics and gravity, velocity, and proximity being the only governing forces of orbital mechanics. Now, the short explanation is that in order for the moon to maintain a consistent speed of about 20 to 88 miles per hour around the Earth, while the Earth is allegedly in motion around the Sun, then the moon must accelerate to extreme velocities at times and decelerate to retrograde speed relative to the previous velocity at other times. Now, those two specific times would be the full moon and no moon phases, respectively. So during the full moon phase, the moon must be accelerating to many times faster than the Earth. And during the new moon phase, the moon would need to decelerate to retrograde in its normal path of motion in order to keep its speed relative to the Earth a consistent 20 to 88 miles per hour on average. So with that in mind, the period of maximum speed will always be the full moon, as it will be traveling around the outside of the Earth's orbital track, racing against the Earth, poised from the half moon in the west to pass the Earth at 2,288 miles per hour relative to the Earth. A week or so later, after the full moon, the moon would need to decelerate to the exact velocity, so direction and speed as the Earth, as the half moon's in the east of the Earth's alleged trajectory through space. Then the moon would need to necessarily decelerate to the position of no moon and actually retrograde relative to its typical motion in order to maintain a counterclockwise rotation at about 2288 miles per hour relative to the Earth, while the Earth allegedly races in the opposite direction compared to the moon's velocity. So the moon must necessarily retrograde in order to maintain its relative constant speed relative to the Earth. During the full moon phase, keeping in mind that these are objects in free space, which are only held in relationships together by gravity, that is only purported to be an attractive or accelerative force between two objects, and certainly not a repulsive force or a structural material. So, after the moon goes through the no moon phase, while the Earth allegedly races in the opposite direction compared to the moon's velocity, relative to the full moon phase. So you've got the opposite motion of the moon relative to the Earth during the no moon phase. Finally, the moon would necessarily need to accelerate through the half moon phase west of the Earth's trajectory and repeat this peculiar, nonsensical, hypothetical cycle all over again, where the moon must somehow accelerate to beat out the Earth around the outside of the hypothetical orbital track, so to speak, strictly by the force of gravity. Now, this all works fine and dandy if you consider the spokes of a wheel behaving as gravity, or a frisbee and some dot on the radius of that frisbee being the moon. You can sort of think about it like that. However, the spokes of a wheel or a frisbee, the center of those objects act as structural and tensile boundaries. So the hubs or the spokes of the wheel act as structural and tensile boundaries with an equal radius throughout. That is what keeps your wheels to your tires or your spokes. It's that tension and structural integrity of the wheel or the spokes. Gravity simply cannot behave as a structural tensile boundary and is only claimed to be an acceleration between two bodies' center of gravity, in this case the moon and the Earth, hypothetically. So if you can imagine the spokes of a wheel essentially disappearing or actually tugging the radius of the tire towards the center whenever that point gets in front of your path of motion, then you'd be in for one hell of a bumpy ride, excuse the language, but um, gravity just simply doesn't account for theoretical orbital mechanics in the slightest. It's not physically possible to have what they say is going on in terms of orbital mechanics simply using the force of gravity, velocity, and proximity. It doesn't work. And you can watch my series playlist, The Fallacy of Gravity, or my other playlist, Disproving Orbital Motion, if you're interested. I'll put a couple of cards and end screened videos for your convenience. So, since gravity doesn't account for theoretical orbital mechanics in the slightest, and the world is measurably flat and stationary, the east-west shadow of the eclipse is theoretically possible in the heliocentric model. Um, that doesn't mean anything. I mean, lots of things are theoretically possible. That doesn't make them true. Um, the reason we're having such a problem with this is because Lions has had over 500 years to perfect and change their story and change their values around and get everything just right so that it kind of works in theory. You know, the mathematics seem to work out in most of the cases. However, when you actually apply logic and reason to the mathematics and apply this to reality, the mathematics are simply not describing reality. They're describing a logically repulsive version of reality that is based on assumption and philosophical preference, indeed. So, again, you know, one of the biggest problems I have with eclipses in general is the hypothetical inverted shadows cast by celestial bodies, which only occurs in the heliocentric theory and never in reality in order to make their theory work. I don't think the upcoming eclipse on the 21st of this month, again being August of 2017, proves or disproves flat Earth, but plenty of the other attributes of eclipses in general indeed disagree with the heliocentric model in many, many, many instances and sound more like a big fishtail than science. And the beauty really about flat Earth is we don't need a model. And we can't possibly create a model with the current Antarctic and Arctic treaties in place, as they are preventing us from doing a full geodetic survey of the polar regions, which are the key to understanding exactly how the flat and stationary Earth is laid out. I believe this information became obvious to the Nazis during World War II, as well as the Russians, and finally the Americans with Admiral Byrd's alleged trek to the Antarctic, Operation High Jump. Instead of admitting to the world that all of theoretical science was wrong for the last 500 years about the hypothetical, preposterous spinning ball Earth theory and rewriting the world history of scientism or liance, starting with Pythagoras or Eratosthenes, instead, they made it illegal for us to free roam and survey the most important places on Earth if we want to flesh out the true nature of the world. The base camps in Antarctica are cordoned off from one another so that we can surely visit the Antarctic on a guided tour, but it is not legal or possible for regular citizens to circumnavigate the far south. It's illegal for anyone to free roam beyond 60 degrees south or explore the far north between the so called dew line and Russia. So, with that, I want to thank you guys for your time. Thank you guys for listening to me. I really appreciate all you guys. Love y'all. If you want to support this channel, you can do so direct to PayPal through www.paypal.me/TheMorgile1 or at Patreon to www.patreon.com/TheMorgile. I'll put links in the descriptions, cards, and links to all of the videos and series mentioned in this video in the descriptions as well. So with that, God bless you all. Spread the word, spread the world, and peace.